Are chatbots like ChatGPT alive? Are conversations the best medium for both philosophy and chatbots? Well, what is the difference between how philosophers and chatbots actually understand the world? We're going to learn about that today. This is a Lit Media Workshop. We're going to be talking about chatbots, and this is part one: chatbots, Socrates, and conversations. So I thought the nice framing for this would be to talk about what the differences are here between chatbots and philosophy, and where even things like this started. But before we talk about that, let's talk about what a chatbot even is, and somebody named Alan Turing. Alan Turing was a jack of all trades computer scientist. He's one of the most famous computer scientists there are, and he came up with something called the Turing test. And in this test, there's an observer. This observer tries to type into their computer. So they have a computer, they keep typing messages. Let's say that they might type a message like hello right here. And then on the other side, one of two things happens. Either there is a bot that's actually typing behind the terminal, sending messages to the computer, or there's an actual human that is behind this. So in these two different options, computer and human, if the observer can't tell whether or not they are speaking to a computer or a human, or it has the same basic probability, no matter if the computer is sending it or if the human is sending messages back and forth, well, then they pass the Turing test. This test has now been passed. And as we saw in class, Alan Turing developed this test in the 1950s. This was a very, very long time ago. And it shows just how much attention that he had and ability to kind of almost read the future. So very interesting. We might return to Turing here in a little bit. But first, let's talk about this actual medium, right? This is a class about media literacy, and as a reminder, we're talking about media. Media is basically something that you might use to write with. We talked about things like tablets and how ancient people used tablets to make records of things. And in day-to-day conversation, oftentimes we're actually using something called conversation to talk to each other. So I say something and then you say something, and then I say something and then you say something, and these go on and on and on until we come to some kind of a conclusion. We saw this a little bit when we talked about protocols before. But let's talk about some of the aspects of conversations. What are actually in a conversation? Let's think about this in terms of two different aspects. One of them is examples. Can you think of some examples of where you would have conversations or where conversations are used as a medium? Take a minute and think about that. One of them is, of course, chatbots. Another one would be things like plays from people like Shakespeare or whatever. You have lots of different characters, they do different things. Other examples would be like our everyday interactions, right? What about like a phone call? Right? These are all examples of conversations, sometimes in everyday life, sometimes not. Another important one that we'll talk about today is philosophy. Philosophy means the love of knowledge. We have philo and sophy. Sometimes, yeah, and there's some famous people who we will be talking about with regards to that. I also want to think about these qualities of conversations. So what are some of the qualities of conversations? Well, This includes turn taking, understanding through synthesis. So if I can talk and you can talk, we can come to some kind of a mutual agreement, hopefully. They're good for records. You can keep an account of what actually happened and what people said. See things like Congress and Robert's Rules of Order. Conversations can also be useful when you're doing things like having roles or characters, especially in something like a play. But even just in our mind's eye, when we think about something, we can sometimes change perspective during a conversation. This is a very useful thing. So hopefully by the end of a conversation, we've reached some kind of a conclusion, right? Remember the definite end on the telephone. You want a conversation to have someplace it's going, some kind of who's doing what when. Other times conversations can end up in an impasse. You might not actually have any new information and you may be just as confused as when you started, or you might figure out that the thing that you were trying to figure out to begin with was actually much more complicated than you thought it was to begin with. And if you have a conversation and there's some yelling, sometimes you call that an argument. Now, you may know this already. Common parlance, you have good faith arguments. And in a good faith argument, you might say something like, well, I disagree with this person, but I know that they're arguing honestly. They're not just trying to win. And in philosophical terms, sometimes you call this a valid argument, or maybe just an honest argument. Otherwise, you also have bad faith arguments. This reminds me of when we were talking about talking to trolls. If there's somebody who doesn't actually want to come to some kind of synthesis or to be able to discuss something, you may just have something impossible. And those really aren't really worth having, I don't think. If somebody isn't actually trying to engage in a conversation, it's better just not to talk with them and not to force that. What if someone thought of some reasons or some actual structures for good arguments? What are some good ways that we can argue something? Well, one of the most famous ones is called a syllogism. And the argument goes something like this. It starts with something called a premise. And that premise is all men are mortal. It means they might die someday. Right? We could call that number 2. Then you would say something like Socrates, a philosopher we'll talk about in just a minute, is mortal. Therefore, Socrates. Oh, I messed it up. We can't just say that Socrates is mortal. We have to say Socrates is a man. Then we can say, therefore, Socrates is mortal. True, valid. If it's true that all men are mortal, and it's true that Socrates is a man, then it follows that Socrates is mortal. And he is mortal, but he's also kind of literarily immortal. He's very, very influential. And he came up with some of these valid arguments that I want to talk about right now. If you go to the great Wikipedia.com, you can see this list of valid arguments. And yeah, if A then B, A therefore B. So this is a modus ponens. This is like a kind of an argument. And if A then B, A therefore B. That's basically the format that I was using just then. If Kelly does not finish his homework, he will not go to class. Kelly did not finish his homework. Therefore, Kelly will not go to class. Here's another one. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. If the Saints win the Super Bowl, there will be a party in New Orleans that night. There was no party in New Orleans that night. Therefore, the Saints did not win the Super Bowl. And so there's all of these different forms, and it's pretty cool. There's also a bunch of logical fallacies, things like ad hominem, where instead of actually attacking some kind of an argument, you attack the person. So instead of saying that Socrates is making a bad point, if you call Socrates a stupid person, that's an ad hominem. That would be an example of bad faith. Should we take a look at those? I think maybe we should take a look at those. Oh, here's our list of fallacies. We have formal fallacies, things like an appeal to probability, arguments from fallacy, non sequiturs, where the conclusion does not logically follow from the premise. We also have other syllogistic ones. And then we have informal ones. These are the ones I'm more familiar with. An argument from incredulity, when someone can't imagine something to be true, therefore they think it isn't true. Let's find ad hominem. An ad hominem is a kind of a red herring fallacy. Now, a red herring is just a big stinky fish. So one way to have a bad faith argument is to just present something that doesn't really make sense, but makes a big stink. And a famous one of that is the ad hominem, basically attacking the person instead of attacking the actual argument. There's a lot of different versions of this, and you should probably learn them, not so that you can use them, but that so that you can recognize them if someone is trying to use them. Now, some of these valid forms of argument can become kind of complicated. And what makes things even more complicated is that oftentimes we can't agree on the premise. So there's this whole class of argumentation, and there's something called a premise or an assumption. And there's this big issue where everybody seems to think that everybody begins with the same kinds of facts at the same time. But that isn't actually borne out when people have conversations and try to see if they can understand one another. So, you might think that there's one version of justice, but someone else might think there's another version. And that's kind of at the heart of a very important figure we're going to talk about now. Really, three different figures. And that figure is Socrates. There are basically three most important people in philosophy, and they all happen to be in Athens. That video that I showed kind of as an intro is from Raphael's painting of the School of Athens. And Athens, as you may know, was the Greek kind of central of the knowledge world for a long time. Most of the actual philosophy, at least in the West, is written in Greek until maybe 800 years after that. And the three main people are basically Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Let's take a look at an image that illustrates this. This is brought to you by whatever blog this is. And these are really important figures here. So we have Socrates, who is actually much older than Plato, and Plato was Socrates' disciple among many people. And in his dialogues, in his writings, he wrote The Republic. You might have heard of his analogy of the cave. He does everything that he can to explore different ideas. What is justice? What would be a perfect city? What is correct? What's a good way to live? And I don't have time to go into all of his philosophies, but I will say that he was sort of like an idealist. He believed in understanding things by building up different premises and then coming to logical conclusions. And oftentimes, he basically just remembers or pretends or recounts different things that Socrates said to himself and to friends. Aristotle was Plato's disciple or teacher. Plato was Aristotle's teacher. And Aristotle goes on more of an empirical bend, where he's looking for things like actual data and evidence and saying that this is the way the world works because we observe it. Plato would have said something like, we can observe only some of the world, but there are rules behind that which make it work the way it does. And there's all kinds of other people you might have heard of in this picture, included Euclid, Diogenes, Pythagorean theorem. Anybody? That's this guy's fault. And these are all kind of depicted, all in this school of Athens, where everyone is learning from each other. So, what is it that Socrates, as remembered by Plato, what is it that he thinks about, right? So he's like thinks about thinking, thoughts on thoughts. He's always doing things like explaining things by illustrating them in conversations. He's very criticized for impasses. For example, let's take one about justice, right? And that example is, let's say that you have something that you've taken from a friend and the friend wants it back. Should you give it to them? I think probably yes, you should give them the thing. Aha. Now that you've agreed about that, what if the thing that you would give your friend is something bad that they shouldn't have, right? Let's say that they're grounded and they want to have their video game system back that they borrowed from you. Well, if you give the video game system back to them and you know they're grounded, you're helping them disobey their parents, right? So there's a bunch of exceptions to some of the things that you find in there. Um, Socrates, or maybe actually more like Plato, they talk about other things too, right? Building a city. What are the things that you would need to build a city? He talks about things like guardians. It's kind of communistic, I guess, where you have this idea of like a philosopher king that you could teach from a very young age to be very special and learn all kinds of wise different things. Kind of a funny thing. But the point is he does all of this through conversations. And what ends up happening is you'll start on one topic and you'll try to come to a definition. For example, that definition on justice, which is very tricky. And then you'll kind of like add some other things to this idea and more and more and more, and the conversation just keeps growing and growing and growing. And at the end of the conversation, they'll try to collect just a couple of things and try to synthesize it into some idea of what justice actually was. But it kind of reminds me of hypertext, where the actual thing that you learn is just this conversation that weaves in and out all of the possible ideas you might have about what justice was in the first place. We'll go through a couple of examples. I thought about just reading this, but maybe I'll find a video that y'all can watch that describes some of these detailed conversations that Plato has. One of the interesting things about Plato is that some people hold that before Plato really existed, that people never really thought about thinking, that the conversations that they had were never quite so abstract as to say something like, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So, this whole idea of changing perspectives, of trying to ask lots of people who might be wise, or well studied to come to some kind of a synthesized conclusion. It's like a very, very new kind of an idea. So that kind of covers human thinking. And we could summarize that kind of human thinking, or we had this question, right? What's the difference between how humans think versus how bots think? So humans, in their best moments, they might think step by step. They might do something like draw from their own experiences. Um, and they might like ask friends. And there's this whole concept of the mind's eye. And the mind's eye is basically like you can even have conversations with people who don't exist in your head as a way to kind of feel out whether or not something is a good idea, right? So you might think, if I ask my mom if I can play video games, but I haven't cleaned my room, well, she's probably going to ask me if I clean my room and I'll have to say no. So, so I'm going to go clean my room first. Now, bots think in a very, very different way. And sometimes this is described as a stochastic parrot. Stochastic means probability. And probability kind of means like random chance. So let's put a pin on where we are here and talk about that generally, because I know some of you have not really looked at that very deeply yet. So let's talk about this first in terms of a coin flip, right? Let's say that you have a coin, the coin has a head side, and the coin also has a tail side. If you flip that coin 1,000 times, right? Let's say you flip it 1,000 times, then about 500 are going to be heads and about 500 are going to be tails. Have you ever flipped a coin 1,000 times before? Well, actually, it's not always like this, right? Usually it might be something like 490 versus 510, or it might be something even like 450 versus 550. And it may be a super rare case. It might be something like 400 to 600. It's never, in practice, something like 1 versus 999. Why is that? It's kind of complicated, right? But basically, each time you flip heads and tails, it doesn't matter, right? Because it does not change based on the previous thing. So for example, if I flip the coin heads and then heads and then heads and then heads, and I asked you, what's the chances that it's going to flip to tails on the next flip? You might think, well, it's flipped heads 4 times, so I think it's a pretty high chance. And really, it's still just 50% or 50-50 or 0.5 is how I would probably describe it. So if you wanted to make something fair and you had to make a choice, you could do that with a coin really easily. Well, computers are very, very good at picking random things. And random things can help you make really fun stuff. Things like Minecraft, right? You might have random terrain that looks like this. And all of these might actually be some small random numbers that are kind of more simple. Something like Perlin noise or simplex noise. These are used all over the video game industry for generating worlds from scratch. Now, if you wanted to have a very, very simple chatbot, you could ask it yes or no questions, and it could flip a virtual heads or tails. And let's say that you had this coin, and half of the time, the bot just said yes. And half of the time, the bot just said no. Well, you could ask it any yes or no question, and it would give you an answer. The answer would probably not be right, depending on what question you asked it, but that's how it might work with probability. Well, in terms of how chatbots work, is they're using probability. So let's go back to what we were looking at just a second ago. So we have an idea of what probability actually is. We can think about it in terms of heads and tails coins. We can think about it as a bot that might say yes or might say no. And the other part of statistics is knowing things like how often is it heads, how often is it no. Um, and so I'll put here in quotes reading. Lots of content. The way that a computer like ChatGPT is able to answer your questions is because it's seen a lot of data. It's seen a lot of content. It's almost seen, I've heard it called the whole internet. That's not quite right. But it has seen quite a bit of the internet. And because it's seen so much of the internet, it can kind of like copy things, right? So we could call it like a copycat. Maybe a copycat with style. And one of the things that makes it possible for computers to go through and read so much information has to do with something that Rich Sutton, who is a pioneer in terms of how AI works generally and has been super duper influential in different important research fields of AI. He calls this the bitter lesson. And in this bitter lesson, basically, he says that the biggest lesson that can be read from 70 years of AI research is that the general methods that leverage computation are ultimately the most effective and by a large model. So, by computation, Sutton is talking about the ability to flip a lot of coins and to see whether the answer is going to be something good or something bad. And we can do this thanks to something like this. This is a GPU. This GPU contains so much computation. It's a 1080 Ti NVIDIA card. NVIDIA is owning all the computational space right now, at least. And it can conduct so many computations that if you were to take the same kind of computing power in, say, 1990, 20 years before this was created, it would fill up like a whole room. So basically, every 20 years or so, something that used to take up a whole room seems to only take up about this much space. And because of that, things that used to be really, really hard or expensive are no longer that way. Instead, they're cheap. They are very, very cheap. And so why does that matter? Well, it means that all of the solutions that people use to try to make for solving problems with computers, they don't really matter that much compared to having lots and lots of computing power. So instead of trying to think about a good way of thinking for a computer, it's actually better just to throw a lot of computation at the computer and to say, hey, if I had infinity computation, how would I solve this? And so he makes a lot of different arguments here. He talks about computer chess in 1997, where basically people couldn't beat computers anymore. Um, the same thing happened in the computer game Go, and I'm not going to go over that. If you're really interested in that, I do recommend that you take a look at that paper. So let's get back to what's the difference between how computers think and bots think, or rather, the difference between how humans think and bots think. Bots think through a process called computation. And it's like doing lots of math. And it's kind of like that conversational simulation that we were talking about before. Humans, they use their brain. Maybe they use some other stuff too. And they have to be a lot more computationally cheap. It's true that all men are mortal, that all people are mortal, and that we only have a finite, not infinite amount of computational power. And so part of being able to use things like chatbots effectively as a medium is to know when you should be reading something, when you should be asking additional questions, and to be able to figure out when a computer or a person is having a good faith versus a bad faith kind of a conversation with you. So, with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about what people actually do with stuff like ChatGPT. And for that, I'm going to turn to a paper called Instruct GPT. This is a publicly available paper that you can read. It's from the people who created ChatGPT at OpenAI. And it talks about how it actually works. And the rumor is that ChatGPT is basically just GPT-3 with extra data and slightly different tuning. So the paper goes over all kinds of things, including things like how do you actually align a chatbot to have the same kinds of values that you have, or to try to give you correct answers rather than incorrect answers. But let's just look at this part, which I found very interesting. This is what people actually use ChatGPT for, and this is old. This is like 2023, I think. And a lot of times people use it for generation. Things like make me a poem, tell me something, tell me a joke, write me a paper. Sometimes they do open question and answers where they're like, I just kind of want to sort of know a little bit about this topic. Sometimes they do brainstorming, and this is 12%. So 1 out of 10 times it's about brainstorming. And that's like, give me a whole bunch of ideas for YouTube titles. This is the kind of video that I want. They have rewrites. They have chat. It's just like, I just want to say hello. Rewrites are like, fix my typos. This is a summary of a Broadway play summary. This is the outline of a commercial for that play. And they want you to kind of rewrite that. There's also generation, for example, writing a short story. And there's brainstorming, for example, listing 5 ideas for how to regain enthusiasm for my career. This seems a little depressing, honestly. There's summarization, which is like, I have this big thing and I don't want to read it. Can you please give it to me in a short amount of sentences? Classification, where they're like, what is this piece of text? What is it from? Other, anything. Close question and answer. It's like copying a, is this, or is that, or tell me the answer to this, and then extract. So here's a whole bunch of text. I only want to see the names from the text. Now, the weird thing about ChatGPT and about large language models is, and this probably has something to do with their thinking, is that they're stochastic, right? And because they're stochastic, just like when you used to roll the dice, you would expect things to be 500 and 500, but sometimes it's like 490 and 510. Sometimes the answers are just wrong. We're going to go over some of those examples at a future date. But for now, let's quickly return to the original questions that we had in this video and see if we have come to an impasse or actually have an answer to them. The first question was, are bots alive? I will say no. Bots are not alive. We saw that GPT Instruct paper, and it describes all of the things that you would need to create it. So as long as this GPU is not alive, I think that bots are not alive. Are conversations the best medium for both philosophy and for bots? I will say maybe. Um, I think they might be the best ones that we have. And I think you can probably convert most actions that people take into a form of a conversation. Think of something like salsa dancing. That's kind of a conversation as well. Our last question was about what's the difference between bots and humans and how they think, or bots and philosophers. Well, I think the main thing is that bots, they can think forever, or they can think through all of the different possibilities, but I think all of those possibilities are quantized. They're represented somehow in some kind of a discrete space. So because bots don't experience the world in the same way that we do, because they're not really alive, I think that really impacts the way that they think. Human thinking, I don't know. I would kind of represent it like this, where it's wandering, but it's also based on some organic things, right? They're based on our actual actions in the world. It's based on our senses. And then we have this whole concept of the mind's eye. And people can actually put themselves in the positions of other people. So even if I'm this person over here, I might be able to think like this person over here and imagine how they're thinking and vice versa. And I think that's what makes humans special, is our ability to put each other in each other's space and to be able to simulate that. And that's kind of what makes this whole Turing test so interesting, because it kind of cheats a little bit, right? There's a computer, there's a human, and we can't tell exactly who we're talking to, but that's because we're not actually dealing with the human. We're actually dealing with the human seen through a computer. And so it's kind of like we're on the computer's turf. Okay, that's it for now. Next time, we're going to talk about we're going to talk a little bit more about the history of AI. We're going to talk about breaking down some of the mechanics for how these chatbots actually work, and we'll go through a couple of examples that use chatbots to do something. So be proud to be a human. And yeah.